Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Abraham Lincoln, and the focus is taking a stand. The year is 1854, and even after the Compromise of 1850 from a couple of years ago, still a lot of anxiety in the United States about the topic of slavery and slavery expansion. A lot of that was focused on potential expansion into the Mexican cession, the land that was acquired from Mexico in the recent war. But also on the table was another part of territory that had been acquired much earlier in the Louisiana Purchase. This was the area in the northern part of the country called Nebraska. And this was a vast prairie land from the Missouri River to the Rocky Mountains. Handful of Indian tribes, lots of animals, but mostly barren land for all this vast territory. Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois, wanted to open up Nebraska for American settlers. And partly he wanted to do it because of the talk about a transcontinental railroad. He wanted that to go through the north, which would help his state of Illinois and the city of Chicago. So he was asked, what would you do about slavery in this area? Well, Douglas had an answer, and he pointed to democratic principles. He said, you know what? Let's let the people decide. In the past, Congress had decided things about legislation in territories, including slavery. Douglas said, let's take it out of their hands. Give it to the people who were going to live there. Let them make their own decision about whether or not they wanted to have slavery. He called it popular sovereignty. Well, the reactions about popular sovereignty in Nebraska were pretty strong on both sides of the equation, and lots were against. In the North, a lot were against because, well, they had kind of accepted slavery in the states where it already existed. Increasingly, the people in the North wanted no more expansion. The South, the opposite. They wanted unlimited expansion and didn't want anything that could potentially curtail that, and they saw popular sovereignty as potentially putting a halt on slavery expansion if that's the way the votes went. The other catch was the law. The Missouri Compromise that had been passed 3.5 decades before explicitly said that in territory acquired in the Louisiana Purchase, there would be no more slavery above the 3630 parallel. The Nebraska Territory sat in that space. Well, Douglas's committee in the Senate went forward with what they called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They actually created 2 territories out of this vast land, one called Nebraska. Below that was the Kansas Territory. Slavery would be decided based on popular sovereignty per this statute. They pitched this to President Franklin Pierce. He was supportive of it, and they even pitched him to say explicitly to revoke the Missouri Compromise as part of this legislation, and Pierce signed on for that as well. Abraham Lincoln was very much against all of this, and it was a point where he was no longer going to sit on the sidelines on this particular topic. So when Douglas came back to the state of Illinois and started to go on the stump to generate some support for his bill so that it would become law, Lincoln started following him around, and one of these speeches from Douglas was at the State Fair in Springfield. And after Douglas was done, Lincoln was encouraged by his supporters to get up on the stage and respond. And so Lincoln did. And he said, we were proclaiming ourselves political hypocrites before the world by thus fostering human slavery and proclaiming ourselves at the same time the sole friends of human freedom. Lincoln was just getting warmed up. Billy Herndon, who was Lincoln's law partner, started to see a change in Lincoln around this time. And he said Lincoln felt burning upon his soul the truths which he uttered, and all present felt that he was true to his own soul. The Nebraska bill was shivered, and like a tree of the forest was torn and rent asunder by hot bolts of truth. At the conclusion of this speech, every man, woman, and child felt that it was unanswerable. Lincoln a bit on a roll. Well, he kept going. Douglas then spoke in the town of Peoria, Illinois. Once again, Lincoln's supporters encouraged him, because he was in attendance, to follow up and make some remarks, in which he did. When the white man governs himself, that is self-government. When he governs himself and also governs another man, that is more than self-government, said Lincoln. That is despotism. Near 80 years ago, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. But now, from that beginning, we have run down to the other declaration, that for some men to enslave others is a sacred right of self-government. These principles cannot stand together. They are as opposite as God and mammon. Well, Lincoln was encouraged by his friends around this time to get back into politics. He had left his position in Congress. He had been focusing on the law, obviously focused on the political topics in these speeches. He was encouraged to run again, this time for the state Senate. He did. He was elected. But he declined to take the office because he learned that if he took that seat, he would be ineligible for this U.S. Senate seat from Illinois that was opening up, and a vote was scheduled for February of 1855. That's the job he wanted, so he backed out of the state legislature role to run for the Senate. He was in that race. In fact, he was first leading on the first ballot, but then he began to fade. And eventually he threw his support behind Lyman Trumbull. Now, Trumbull was anti-Kansas-Nebraska, could potentially be a check on Stephen Douglas in the state of Illinois. Trumbull won that race, and he actually got Lincoln as a political ally out of it, thanks to Lincoln's support. Well, Kansas-Nebraska was passed, and all of a sudden you had this mad rush of Northerners and Southerners into the Kansas territory in particular to try to get a foothold so they could vote their side or the other for popular sovereignty on slavery. And it created a whole bunch of violence and conflict. Called Bleeding Kansas was the nickname given to this, and Lincoln had an opinion about it. According to Lincoln, I look upon that enactment, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, not as a law, but a violence from the beginning. It was conceived in violence, passed in violence, is maintained in violence, is being executed in violence. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of love and liberty, to Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. Well, there was political change going on in the country in terms of political parties. Lincoln's Whig Party had basically disintegrated, and new parties were cropping up. A couple were anti-slavery, like the Free Soil Party and the Liberty Party. You also had the American Party, which was known more likely as the Know-Nothing Party, anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic. Then you've got the Republican Party, a brand new party set in the North, purely sectional party. Their pitch, no more expansion of slavery. Lincoln was gravitating to the Republicans. His coming out party as a Republican took place at a convention in Bloomington where a lot of speeches were given against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is May of 1856, and Lincoln's speech was the highlight, a 90-minute address. Unfortunately, it is completely lost to posterity. He used no notes, there was no scribe, so it's become known as Lincoln's lost speech. But Billy Herndon was there, and he said in his mind this was the best speech Lincoln ever gave. He emphasized two things in this address: no more slavery expansion, but also that to maintain the integrity of the territory of the Union. This was not new. These were not new sentiments for Lincoln, but the speech was unlike any before, according to Herndon. I have heard or read all of Mr. Lincoln's great speeches, and I give it as my opinion that the Bloomington speech was the grand effort of his life. Heretofore, and up to that moment, he had simply argued the slavery question on grounds of policy, on what are called the statesman's grounds, never reaching the question of the radical and eternal right. Now he was newly baptized and freshly born. He had the fervor of a new convert. The smothered flame broke out. This speech was full of fire and energy and force. It was logic. It was pathos. It was enthusiasm. It was justice, equity, truth, right, and good, set ablaze by the divine fires of a soul maddened by wrong. It was hard, heavy, knotty, gnarly, edged, and heated. The words of Billy Herndon about Lincoln's lost speech. 1856, of course, now is also an election year nationally. The Republicans nominated their first candidate ever. It was John Fremont, and in the race, he actually won 11 states. They were all in the upper northern part of the country. This was not a national effort yet from the Republicans. The only national party really in place at this point were still the Democrats. James Buchanan was their candidate, and he won the presidency in 1856. His inauguration, March of 1857, just a couple of days after that, the Supreme Court issued a decision in the case of Dred Scott v. Sandford. Roger Taney, the Chief Justice, wrote, not only deciding against Mr. Scott, but really against all blacks in the United States. According to the court, slavery was a constitutionally protected right. They went further. Slaves were property. They were not people in the eyes of the law. Even more, Congress had no authority to restrict slavery in any state or in any territory, and therefore the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional all along. Well, this sent reverberations throughout the entire country. The South was thrilled. This was their position, basically, hook, line, and sinker, and they were happy that this seemed to be finally resolved. President Buchanan was similarly happy because all he wanted was resolution. He didn't care as much on this topic other than just to get this issue out of the way for good. He thought the Supreme Court had just done that. Of course, in the North, in particular, the Republicans and people like Abraham Lincoln, they were outraged over this. This was the opposite of what they believed, opposite of what they preached. Now, Lincoln was still no abolitionist, but blacks were people in his mind. They did have some rights, and again, totally against any expansion anymore of slavery. Well, Lincoln continued to speak out. At the Republican State Convention in Illinois in 1858, he received the nomination for the U.S. Senate seat from the Republicans, and he was going to run against Stephen Douglas, the Democratic candidate up for re-election. And Lincoln wanted to have a coming out party speech where he was going to make a bold statement. And he wrote out his speech, he showed it to some people, and they pushed back a little. They thought this might be too strong and could hurt him in the election. Lincoln went ahead anyway, in what became known as his House Divided speech. According to Lincoln, a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. Strong statement from Lincoln that most Republicans were pretty thrilled about him taking such a bold stand. Others were actually pretty worried. They thought he might have gone too far and could hurt his chances in the upcoming election against Douglas. But Lincoln dismissed all of those criticisms. He was not backing down at all. He told a friend, Dr. Long, about the speech, "Well, doctor, if I had to draw a pen across and erase my whole life from existence, and I had one poor gift or choice left as to what I should save from the wreck, I should choose that speech and leave it to the world unerased." Lincoln clearly was taking a stand on the most important topic of the day, and that is Abraham Lincoln and taking a stand. From the life of Abraham Lincoln. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.